Hi, everybody. It's your Professor Ian. This is a short lecture on narrative point of view. So let's jump into it. Let me click one button here. There we go. Point of view and narrative expectation. So stories are always narrated by a specific voice that shapes our understanding of the text. This can be a kind of, separated from the action, kind of godlike third person voice, or it could be someone directly involved with the action, a participant or a witness, right? But no matter what that voice is, it's always there telling the story. That helps shape our expectations and our focus in the story, right? Sometimes that voice is attributable to a specific narrator, but sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes it is that kind of floating, again, omniscient, godlike point of view, telling the story and giving us insights into everybody's mind and whatnot. But it's still a specific point of view, and it changes our reaction to the story and our expectations of how the narrative is going to unfold. So the narrator shapes what we focus on in a story, right? Often, if we have a first person narrator, we get a kind of limited focus, and our focus is shaped by the persona that's telling us the story. Or, for example, if you recall the focus on Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour, we get a great insight into her emotions, her mind, her reactions to things. But do we know anything specific about any other characters? There's her sister and brother-in-law, and later her husband, right? But we don't really know anything about this. All we get is that very limited uh, um, point of view, just in her mind, and just basically her reactions. There's always discussion whenever I teach The Story of an Hour about, did they have a bad marriage, the Mallards? I think the implications are that no, they didn't, but we don't get all that detail because the narrator focuses our attention on different things. That's what the story is about. It's about Mrs. Mallard's reaction to the news, not about anything else, right? And so the narrator shapes our focus, shapes our reaction to the story. The narrative voice and focus help set the tone for the story, and tone is just the attitude the narrator, the story has towards the characters, values, and situations in the story. How are you supposed to feel about things, right? Which takes me to the idea of empathy, right? This quality of feeling for another person. Or, if you want a great definition, the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another, of either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Also, the capacity for this. So, feeling for somebody without having it necessarily broken down in an intellectual, specific way. In other words, you're feeling for the character. You're feeling. You're putting yourself in their shoes to a certain extent, right? And empathy is an important part of narrative, of any kind of narrative, but especially short story, because short stories are short by definition. The author needs to make you feel empathy for something going on in the story. You have to feel for something in the story, or else it's not going to be very effective, right? And stories are inherently character based. The character doesn't have to be human, doesn't have to be a person, it can be an animal or an inanimate object. There's Kipling had a whole collection of stories uh, where the character, the protagonist, the main character of the story was either an animal or an inanimate object, but it's still a character, right? It's still something you empathize for, something you root for, you can feel for. Otherwise, again, it wouldn't work. If Kipling just described a horse in a field, that might be interesting, but that's not going to create a compelling narrative, right? Our empathy for the main and minor characters is an important factor. So, how does the author want us to feel about the characters in the story? What is the tone? How are our impressions about characters filtered through the narrative voice? Again, think about Mrs. Mallard. Do you feel empathy for Mrs. Mallard? Are you supposed to? If you didn't feel empathy for her, would the story work when you get to the end and there's that twist? Would you care if you didn't care about Mrs. Mallard? I don't think you would, because it wouldn't have the same punch, right? When you get to the end and then she dies, it's like, wow, she died. She had this great moment of freedom. I was really rooting for her. She was gonna live her life to the fullest. She was gonna what do people say? I can't even remember the expression people use, but be the real her, right? she was going to live every day, and et cetera, et cetera. And then suddenly she dies, and there's this twist. So without that empathy for Mrs. Mallard, the story really doesn't have any kind of effect on the reader. So let's get into some specifics. Point of view, right? There's some technical terms we use to talk about point of view. There is, of course, first, second, and third point of view, right? First is I, we, us. Second is you, your. Third is he, she, nouns, people's names, right? You might know from taking English 1A that you're supposed to use third person for your more objective formal writing, and then first person is more writing your own opinion, and second person is more instructional. You should do this, you should do that. But we can also add some more specific literary complications to this. So to break down the third person more specifically, we talk about unlimited omniscient third person point of view, limited omniscient third person point of view, and objective third person point of view. Okay, so let's go through those. So unlimited omniscient, this uses third person pronouns, he, she, they, the woman, all the third person pronouns. It has unlimited access to the thoughts of every character in the story. So this is that godlike perspective I was talking about before, that completely all-knowing, that's what omniscient means, all-knowing perspective that can give the reader feelings and thoughts from any character in the story, and usually does. The limited omniscient point of view uses the same third-person pronouns, he, she, they, Mrs. Mallard, names, nouns, but only gives you limited access to the thoughts of each character in the story, of every character in the story, right? And this point of view is often used to withhold information from the reader for dramatic effect. So, we don't know what anybody else other than Mrs. Mallard, and there's a typo there, Mrs. Mallard is thinking, right? And this creates a dramatic effect because we don't know whether she's justified in feeling this. Again, we don't know if her marriage is bad. We just know that she feels this utter sense of freedom being let loose from her marriage, right? And by limiting that, it creates more of a dramatic effect, and it focuses us more on Mrs. Mallard. Imagine the story is written with that unlimited omniscient point of view, and you had, the writer took us into the sister and the husband and what they're thinking. It would be a very different story. It might be effective. I don't think it would have the same punch, right? The beauty of the story of an hour is that it's so short and it's such a roller coaster of emotion, and that's partially created by this limited omniscient point of view. We're only in Mrs. Mallard's head. We only get her reaction, and so we're along for the ride. The other point, third person point of view, we talk about is objective. So this uses third person pronouns, again, he, she, they, the woman, Mrs. Mallard, nouns such as and other third person pronouns, but has no access to the thoughts of every character in the story. So it's like a story in the newspaper. It's just reporting the facts, just the facts, without taking you inside the interior world of a character. So, for example, Ernest Hemingway wrote a lot in this kind of objective third person point of view. So here's the ending of Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. Great story. I usually teach in a class like this. I don't think I am this semester. I'm not sure, actually, though. I'll check the syllabus. Anyways, he picked up the 2 heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other tracks. He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. He went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. Do you feel better? He asked. I feel fine, she said. There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine. And if you read the rest of the story, you know that she's not feeling fine. But the narrator doesn't tell us that. You have to put that together as the reader. She just doesn't want to talk about it anymore, and it's pretty obvious when you read the story. And he's just going to get the bags, but he stops at the bar and has a drink. So this tells you something about his character. This tells you something about her character. But the narrator doesn't overtly do that work for you. He doesn't give you the man's thoughts or the woman's thoughts. Instead, you have to piece it together by speech and their actions. So that's the objective third person point of view. Just to review second person and first person. So second person uses the pronoun you to directly address the reader. And this is very rare in fiction. We don't usually see this in any kind of narrative, short fiction, long fiction. Margaret Atwood has a great short story called Happy Endings, where she uses this to play with the idea of romantic stories and romantic endings. But it's super rare. In this example, John and Mary meet. What happens next? If you want a happy ending, try A. So she's directly playing with the reader and their expectations for happy endings in stories. And first person, this of course uses the pronouns I, we, us, right, to narrate a story from a specific perspective. And that's the whole thing about first person. It's a specific persona telling you the story that they witnessed or participated in. So, for example, this is from James Joyce's Araby. Gazing up in the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. Right? So very passionate, personal, specific feeling from this one character, right? And your empathy for that character drives your reaction to their feelings about this. Remember, I was talking about empathy earlier, right? And sometimes first-person narratives have an auditor, what we call an auditor, so a listener, a kind of listener in the story that doesn't speak, but whose possible reaction could be part of the story. So this is from the Cask of Amontillado, the Edgar Allan Poe story. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunado I have borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. I should say threat, not treat. Utterance to a threat. So in this story, the narrator is speaking to someone, but we don't know who. It could be that the narrator is writing this directly to the audience, to the reader, but it doesn't seem that he is. He seems to be speaking and confessing to somebody. Some theories about the story is that he's speaking to a confessor in a church setting. And then finally, when we're talking about first-person perspective, especially, sometimes third person can do this, but usually it's first person. Sometimes the author will use an unreliable narrator. So some stories are narrated by insane, foolish, or deceptive narrators. And when we can see we can see there's a difference between what actually happened and what the narrator is telling us, we call this narrator unreliable. So sometimes authors will play with our expectations of how narrative works by having the narrator, again, insane, lying to us. If we come back to the Cask of Amontillado, the narrator, as we find out as the story progresses, is probably not sane. He's obsessed with revenge. And so you have to think, well, can we trust what he's telling us? Did Fortunato actually insult him? Or is this a perceived insult and he's overreacting and he's gone insane with rage? So when you're reading stories, narratives, you should ask yourself, do you trust the narrator? Why or why not? And most narrative rests on the expectations that you do trust the narrator. So that's why an unreliable narrator is can be so much fun when you read it. But anyways, that's about it for now. Thank you very much, and have a good night.